In June of 1876, on the rolling plains of Montana, a clash unfolded that would echo through history, the Battle of the Little Bighorn. To most Americans today, the Battle of the Little Bighorn is remembered as Custer's last stand, a doomed charge, a massacre, a turning point in the Great Sioux War. While much has been said about General Custer and his men, the voices of those who saw it unfold often remain unheard. Among them were the Arikara Scouts, skilled warriors and trackers who guided the U.S. Army that fateful day. Their eyes witnessed the movements, their warnings that went unheeded, and the chaos that led to one of the greatest defeats in American military history. In this video, we uncover their rare testimonies, which decades later became some of the most vivid testimonies of what truly led to Custer's destruction. Stories passed down from those who were there, revealing a perspective that history books rarely tell. Before we dive in, like and subscribe to our channel to help our community grow. The Arikara people, sometimes called the Ree, were not of the same nations that gathered to resist U.S. expansion along the Little Bighorn River. In fact, they had their own history of conflict with the Lakota Sioux and the Northern Cheyenne. When the U.S. Army called for scouts to aid in the campaign against these tribes, many Arikara men, hunters, trackers, and warriors answered. Their reasons were layered. Some saw it as an alliance of survival, others as an opportunity to strike at old enemies, and some, as they would later admit, were swept along by promises and pressures they could not easily refuse. Among them were names history now only whispers: Young Hawk, Red Star, Soldier, Red Bear, Strikes Two, Bobtailed Bull, and their chief scout, the legendary Bloody Knife. 23 scouts rode with Custer's 7th Cavalry that summer, each armed with a carbine, a revolver, and their own knowledge of the plains. They were the eyes and ears of the expedition, riding far ahead of the main column, reading the signs of the land, and interpreting the movements of the enemy. The chief told us, "You will go first. You will look for their camps. You will find the trail and bring it to me." We did not know then how many would ride to their deaths. Custer's campaign began at Fort Abraham Lincoln in present-day North Dakota on May 17, 1876. The 7th Cavalry, numbering over 600 men, set out as part of a three-pronged effort to trap the Sioux and Cheyenne in Montana Territory. The Arikara Scouts, under the command of Lieutenant Charles Varnum and interpreter Fred Girard, rode ahead of the regiment, often scouting miles ahead, slipping between the folds of hills and river valleys where danger might lurk. The life of a scout was dangerous and thankless. They faced not only the risk of enemy war parties, but also mistrust and scorn from the very soldiers they were guiding. Their warnings were often treated as exaggerations, their advice ignored in the face of Custer's own ambitions and impatience. For the Arikara, this was not their war in the same sense it was for the Bluecoats. Their villages had suffered raids by the Sioux. Their crops and trade routes had been threatened. Aligning with the U.S. Army was to them a chance, perhaps the only chance to protect their own people. But as they followed Custer deeper into the contested lands of the Little Bighorn, many began to sense that this was no simple raid or show of force. They saw the smoke of distant camps, the trails of countless ponies, the signs of a gathering far larger than the soldiers imagined. We told them there are many lodges. We counted the tracks. We saw the herds, but they rode on as if the river would stop them. This first episode in our deep dive series is not about the battle itself, but about the days and nights leading to it, the moments where decisions were made, warnings were given, and fate was sealed. Through the words of the Arikara Scouts preserved in interviews decades after the battle, we can trace the steps of that doomed column as it approached the heart of the largest native encampment the plains had ever seen. In the chapters to come, we will walk that trail with them. The lonely stretches of prairie, the chilling omens of a lone teepee with a dead warrior inside, the tense councils of war where Custer brushed aside the scouts' counsel. We will see how the stage was set, not in the heat of the last charge, but in the quiet hours before dawn, when men still believed they had time. For now, remember this: the story of the Battle of the Little Bighorn is not only Custer's nor Reno's, nor Benteen's. It is also the story of the Arikara Scouts who rode at the front, saw the truth with their own eyes, and lived to tell how the storm gathered before it finally broke. The path that led the Arikara Scouts to ride with the 7th Cavalry did not begin on the open plains. It began with a call, one that came from the fort that housed General George Armstrong Custer and his regiment. The Army needed men who knew the land, who could read the grass and the wind, who could ride silently ahead and see what soldiers could not. The Arikara, longtime enemies of the Sioux, had lived for generations along the Missouri River. Their villages had been burned, their fields raided, their people driven to hunger by the relentless pressure of the Lakota and their allies. When the U.S. government prepared its great campaign against the non-treaty tribes, those Sioux and Cheyenne who refused to be confined to reservations, the Arikara were among the first to be asked to provide scouts. We were called to the fort. They told us we would ride before the soldiers, find the camps, and lead them to victory. They said the Sioux would be broken, and our people would be safe. Red Bear, Arikara Scout. The agreement was made quickly, though not without hesitation. The scouts understood the risks. They would be fighting in the heart of enemy country far from their homes. But they also carried old grudges, grievances of stolen horses, murdered kin, and broken peace. To ride with Custer was in their eyes a chance to strike a blow at the Sioux who had long overshadowed them. Among the first to step forward was Bloody Knife, a seasoned warrior who had once served as a scout for Custer before. Fierce and respected, became the chief of the Arikara Scouts, the one whose word carried the greatest weight. Bloody Knife said, "I will go. I know these lands. I know their ways. But we must ride as one or we will not return." Alongside Bloody Knife came others. Young Hawk, Red Star, Soldier, Red Bear, Strikes 2, Little Sioux, and more 23 in all. They were issued carbines, revolvers, and a promise of pay. 3 months' wages for their service. Yet what they carried most was not their new arms, but their own traditions. Bows, knives, medicine bundles, and prayers whispered into the wind. Their role was clear from the start. They would not march in the long column with the heavy wagons. They would ride ahead sometimes alone, sometimes in small bands reading the tracks of ponies, counting lodge poles, finding the fords and trails that could carry an army or trap one. At Fort Abraham Lincoln, the scouts were introduced to the officers of the 7th Cavalry Major, Marcus Reno, Captain Frederick Benteen, and, of course, Custer himself. The general greeted them with the confidence of a man used to victory. He had ridden with Arikara Scouts before, and he trusted their eyes, but not always their judgment. He looked at us and said, "You will lead the way. There is honor in this work. There is pay, and there is glory." We looked at one another, and we did not speak of glory. We spoke only of the trail. The oath was simple. They would serve as scouts for the duration of the expedition, obey orders, and guide the cavalry against the hostile Sioux and Cheyenne. For the Arikara, it was both an alliance and a gamble. If the campaign succeeded, their enemies might be scattered, their villages safer. If it failed, their names would be cursed by both sides. As the last of the supplies were loaded and the cavalry prepared to ride out, the scouts performed their own rites. Some painted their faces with earth from their homeland. Others tied charms to their bridles or carried small medicine bags beneath their shirts. They were stepping into a war that was not fully theirs, but which they would now share. I tied a strip of red cloth to my horse's mane. My father said it would keep me safe, that it would remind me of the blood of our people taken before. I wondered if I would ever see my village again. Arikara, Scout Red Star. On May 17, 1876, the column finally set forth. Soldiers in long blue lines, officers with sabers at their sides, wagons creaking, and ahead of them, barely noticed by the bands and banners, a small company of native scouts riding into the rising dust. They were the first to see the land that would become a graveyard. They were the first to smell the smoke of distant villages. And though history would long remember the names of the white officers who perished, it was these men, the Arikara Scouts, who carried the first burden of the campaign, its hopes, its secrets, and its coming doom. Once the 7th Cavalry left Fort Abraham Lincoln, the wide plains opened before them like a sea of grass. For the Arikara Scouts, the journey was a test of patience, endurance, and constant vigilance. Their task was not simply to ride ahead, but to read the land, every broken blade of grass, every distant smear of smoke, every trail that crossed their path could mean the difference between safety and disaster. Each morning before the sun rose, we saddled our horses. We rode where the soldiers could not see, through the draws and over the ridges. We looked for the marks of many ponies, for the ashes of their fires. Arikara Scout, Young Hawk, said, "The soldiers marched with their bugles and bands, their wagons creaking under supplies. The scouts moved like shadows, sometimes days ahead, sometimes circling back to report what they had seen. They followed the bends of the Heart River, then the Yellowstone, and finally turned south and west toward the valleys where the Sioux and Cheyenne were said to gather. The trail was not always silent. There were times when dust clouds on the horizon stirred unease, when a distant rider appeared and vanished like a mirage. The scouts often reported signs of war parties, fresh tracks, discarded campfires, and the bones of animals recently slaughtered. We saw where they had camped the night before. We counted the lodge poles. There were many more than the officers wanted to hear. They said we should ride faster, that we must catch them before they scattered. Quote, Arikara Scout, Red Star. Tension grew between the scouts and some of the officers. Custer pressed for speed, convinced that striking quickly would prevent the enemy from gathering in force. The scouts, however, knew the plains better. They understood how quickly the Sioux and Cheyenne could call their allies, how fast their pony herds could move. At night, the scouts often camped apart from the soldiers. They built smaller fires, whispered their plans, and sent riders to high ground to watch for movement. Some prayed to their spirits for safe return. Others sharpened their knives and oiled their carbines, knowing each sunrise brought them deeper into hostile country. The soldiers laughed and played their music. We sat apart. We had seen the trails. We felt the land was heavy with enemies. We told them this, but they only nodded and marched on. Quote, Arikara Scout. As the column approached the Powder River, the land began to change: steeper hills, deeper coulees, and the first real signs of large encampments. The scouts brought in reports of pony tracks as wide as riverbeds of cut willows marking recent camps. Yet still, the order was the same: to push forward. Among the scouts, quiet conversations turned to doubt. They spoke of the old ways, the times when their own war parties would turn back if the signs were too heavy. But this was not their war to command. I told Bloody Knife there are too many. This is not like before. He said, we have taken their pay. We will ride until the end. Red Bear. By early June, the trail had grown hotter from the Yellowstone to the Rosebud. They could almost feel the breath of the great camp ahead. The scouts counted the travois marks and knew they were following not a single band but a gathering of nations. The march was relentless. Rain slicked the trails and the sun scorched the plains. Horses grew thin, soldiers irritable. The scouts endured, for their duty was not measured in comfort, but in the silence with which they moved ahead, always a little closer to danger. We began to speak less. Each night the firelight seemed farther from our hearts. We knew we were walking into a place the earth itself wished to keep hidden. Quote, Young Hawk. By the time the scouts crossed into the Little Bighorn country, their warnings had become more urgent. Yet the command pressed on as though momentum itself would carry them to victory. The scouts rode on because to turn back was to break their oath. They were the first to see the river that would be written in blood, but the soldiers behind them still marched with banners raised, believing the enemy would scatter before their arrival. The scouts knew otherwise. As the column pushed deeper into hostile territory, an invisible wall began to rise between the Arikara Scouts and the soldiers they were guiding. Though both groups shared the trail, their worlds were far apart, one forged in the rigid discipline of the U.S. Army, the other in the fluid, hard-earned instincts of the plains. The Arikara Scouts were seasoned hunters and warriors. They read the land like a living book. Every broken twig, every bird's sudden flight told a story. To them, the signs of a large Lakota and Cheyenne presence were growing unmistakable, yet their warnings often fell on deaf ears. The 7th Cavalry rode with confidence, even impatience. To many soldiers, these scouts were merely hired, help useful for their eyes and their horses, but not equals. Scout soldier described the tension in plain words. We told them the enemy was near, that the trails were many and fresh, but they laughed and said we were frightened like women. I felt the anger in my chest, but I held my tongue. There were moments when the scouts openly questioned the pace and purpose of the march. Why move so quickly, so boldly, without first knowing the true strength of their enemy? But the soldiers, driven by Custer's ambition and orders to strike fast, were unwilling to delay. One Arikara later recalled, I told the interpreter, tell the long hair he must wait. Tell him there are many lodges ahead. But the interpreter looked at me and only shrugged. The officers were already mounting their horses. These small dismissals, each one like a stone tossed into a growing river, deepened the mistrust. The scouts were hired allies, yes, but they were also men with their own sense of honor and survival. They began to see that the 7th Cavalry's confidence was not strength, but blindness. And then came the first sign that chilled their bones, the lone tipi. It was a strange and ominous sight, and though the soldiers treated it as a curiosity, the scouts felt its weight. Among the Arikara, such a sight could mean many things: an abandoned lodge, a sign left behind for enemies, or a warning that the land ahead was not empty, but watched. They spoke among themselves, their voices low. This is not good. The Lakota do not leave such things for no reason. It is a message. That message, however, would not be read, or would be read too late. The stage was being set. The scouts felt the pull of two loyalties, one to their contract and one to their own survival. And in the space between those loyalties, doubt began to grow. The days on the trail had already been filled with unease, but nothing prepared the Arikara Scouts for what they would discover on June 25, 1876. This moment would later be etched in their memory as the first undeniable sign that they were riding toward death. Up ahead, nestled quietly on a flat stretch near the Little Bighorn River, stood a lone tipi. It was weathered, its poles leaning slightly, and smoke no longer rose from its opening. The scouts dismounted, weapons ready. They approached with caution, and inside they found a haunting sight, the body of a very old Lakota warrior wrapped in blankets left behind to die. One Arikara Scout Red Star recalled, "We looked at him. His face was painted black. That meant he had made his peace with death. We knew then this was no ordinary village we were following." In Arikara tradition and in the Lakota way, a lone teepee with a dying man was more than just a campsite. It was a message. It warned enemies of the strength ahead. It declared, "Our warriors are many and strong enough to leave this man behind." The scouts gathered around Custer, urging caution. One of them, Bloody Knife, is said to have told him that this means they are not afraid. Their camp is large and strong. We must be careful. But Custer, eager to strike, waved their warnings aside. He believed the village was scattering, not gathering. He pressed the column forward. From that moment on, the Arikara Scouts began to prepare themselves not just as trackers, but as potential survivors. Some tied their medicine bundles tighter, others whispered prayers to the spirits. It was here that fate gave its first true whisper, a warning that only the scouts seemed to hear. The morning of June 25th, 1876 was heavy with a strange stillness. The 7th Cavalry, now deep into Sioux and Cheyenne territory, paused at what would become their last substantial camp before the Little Bighorn. To the soldiers, it was a brief rest, a moment to catch their breath. To the Arikara Scouts, it was a moment of rising dread. As one scout later recounted, "We built a small fire and sat together. We spoke in low voices. The trail we followed was not old. The lodges ahead were many. We feared what lay beyond." At this camp, the scouts tried once more to convey their warnings. They had seen the pony tracks thickening the signs of a large and prepared encampment. Some claimed they saw dust rising in the far distance, a living sign of thousands moving or waiting. One Scout Red Star later told researchers, "I went to the officers and said, there are more of them than we have ever fought before. They are not running, they are waiting," but they did not believe. Tensions deepened. The scouts, many of them Arikara, were not treated as equals by the officers. Their words were heard but not trusted. Their concerns often waved aside as nerves or exaggeration. That morning, Custer held a council with his officers. He consulted his maps, the scouts' trail marks, and the intelligence reports that spoke of a few hundred lodges. Yet by now, the scouts were whispering of hundreds upon hundreds, perhaps more than 1,000 warriors. Bloody Knife, who had served as Custer's trusted interpreter, reportedly said, "I told him this is a big village, maybe the biggest I have ever seen." He laughed a little and said, "We will catch them sleeping." Among the scouts themselves, arguments arose. Should they continue? Should they risk their lives following a man who would not heed them? Some thought of leaving, others stayed out of loyalty, or for the pay they had been promised. By late morning of June 25th, Custer made his decision. He would press on, and he would do so quickly. There would be no waiting for the slower column of General Terry to catch up. The scent of battle was in the air, and he feared the village might slip away if they delayed. As one scout remembered years later, "We watched the soldiers saddle up. The officers laughed among themselves. We did not laugh. This decision made here at this quiet camp sealed the fate of many." For the Arikara Scouts, it marked the moment their warnings turned to resignation. They had spoken, they had advised, and they had been ignored. The Arikara Scouts sensed the storm tightening its grip. The warnings were now more than omens. They were patterns forming into a dreadful truth. Every broken blade of grass, every distant trail of dust spoke of the immense village waiting ahead. Bloody Knife. The most trusted among the scouts rode closer to Custer that morning. In his words, later recalled, "I told him there were more lodges than I had ever seen. I said, if we go in, none of your soldiers will come out alive." They advised waiting for General Terry and Gibbon's column. But Custer, ever the gambler of the frontier, was not a man to retreat at the scent of danger. He believed speed was his ally, surprise his only chance. The scouts, however, saw the village for what it was, a hornet's nest already stirring. It was here near the high bluffs of the Little Bighorn that the final warnings were voiced. Arikara pressed their counsel. Strike together. Keep the column as one. Do not scatter your strength. Bloody Knife again spoke plainly. If you divide, you will feed your soldiers to them piece by piece. Yet the 7th Cavalry was already a creature of divisions, its company strung out, its command a web of rivalries and ambitions. Custer, fearing the Sioux might escape, made his fateful choice to split his regiment. For the Arikara Scouts, this was the moment their hearts sank. They had done what they could, delivered the warnings, pointed out the dangers, read the signs in the earth and sky, but as they later said, the long hair did not hear them. Stab, another Arikara recalled, "We watched them go. It was like watching a man walk into deep water when he cannot swim." With the forces divided, the Scouts knew their role was now fraught with peril. They would ride with Reno first toward the south end of the village, their warnings carried like unheeded prayers. The die was cast. The path to destruction was no longer a matter of chance. It was a matter of time. Major Marcus Reno was ordered to take 3 companies and begin the approach toward the southern end of the encampment. The Scouts were sent ahead, as they often were eyes of the army, yet unheard voices when it mattered most. One Arikara Red Star later recalled, "We saw the village was larger than anything we had been told. The lodges stretched like a river. We looked back to the soldiers, and they came on as if walking into a deep snowstorm, not knowing how far it goes." Reno's command pressed forward into the valley, the tall grass swallowing their lower ranks from sight. The Arikara Scouts, uneasy and whispering among themselves, urged caution. Young Hawk, another scout, said, "I told Reno there are many Sioux. If you go in like this, they will surround you." He only nodded as if he had not heard me. The Scouts had been with the 7th Cavalry long enough to understand the rhythm of its officers' pride, haste, and an underestimation of their enemy. But now, as they watched Reno's men spread into a skirmish line across the valley floor, the pit in their stomachs deepened. We saw dust rising in many places. Remembered Bear's Belly, not from the wind, but from the feet of many ponies. I knew then that the Sioux were moving like a flood to meet us. Reno halted briefly to form his men, the Scouts riding the flanks. Custer was now far behind, taking his own battalion northward, and what the Scouts feared was a reckless gamble to strike another part of the village. The Arikara could sense the trap closing, 2 weak fists striking a single, massive force. One scout rode up to Reno again, his voice urgent. "We saw women and children running. We knew what that meant. The warriors would soon come." I said, "Turn back or wait for the others." He said, "We go on." The Arikara's words were wind in a canyon, echoed but unheard. And so the first shots of Reno's advance cracked across the valley. The Scouts, some dismounting to fire, others wheeling their ponies to carry messages, felt the weight of history shifting. The great village was awake now, its warriors surging like a storm. For the Scouts, this was the beginning of the breaking point, the moment when warning had been spent and destiny had taken the reins.